Nancy Mace, the Republican Congresswoman from South Carolina and shameless grifter, recently went on The Daily Show to try to prop up the lie that she's a reasonable moderate, and unfortunately, she seemed to do pretty well, at least at first. But by the end, Nancy Mace had strained the performance too far, and she was visibly embarrassed as both the host and the audience laughed at and heckled her. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. All right, folks, this one is a part of an ongoing series looking at Nancy Mace, who is one of my least favorite Republican congresspeople, and I know that's very competitive, but she should be among your least favorites as well, because she's very, very good at convincing people, large swaths of the media, including Jake Tapper and CNN and Meet the Press and ABC and CBS, and apparently even The Daily Show, that she's a reasonable, moderate Republican when, in fact, she's anything but. So I have several clips to play. This may be a relatively long video. I definitely encourage you to see the full interview in its entirety, but I've chosen some select clips to kind of emphasize the threat that this woman, who is, again, a vapid grifter in so many ways, but she's very cunning with respect to image politics and presenting herself as a reasonable moderate. So keep all that in mind as we play these clips together.
I'm not your typical Republican. I would say not typical conservative, because when I agree with my party, I support them. When I disagree, I call my party out, and I do it over and over and over again. I would say I have a different flavor of republicanism.
So again, she's very, very good at presenting herself that way. But then the question becomes, okay, well, you say that. Your rhetoric may be a bit atypical of the average establishment Republican, but what about your voting? Well, as the New Republic has broken down, as we've discussed in previous videos, when it comes to votes, Nancy Mace is very much like her fellow establishment partisan Republicans. She's even been called out for backing bills that she has publicly opposed. See, she says that abortion rights and the right to choose is legislatively extremely important to her. She has publicly called out her party for losing women by their hardline pro-life, or as we would call it, pro-forced birth positions. And yet when push comes to shove, she votes for those bills anyway, even the most restrictive bills, because when push comes to shove, Nancy Mace is ultimately a partisan player. But I have more clips to play.
Trust the process, and I think he'll be a better leader than what we had before.
What do you think about, this? How do you think he would feel about this now? Because he once wrote that homosexual relationships are inherently unnatural and that gay marriage is the dark harbinger of chaos and sexual anarchy that could doom even the strongest republic.
Well, we vote.
So to be clear, they're referring to the newly anointed Republican Speaker, Mike Johnson, whom, during this interview, Nancy Mace enthusiastically supports. So the guest host, Charlamagne the God here, is pointing out, listen, Mike Johnson has said some terrible things about, the LGBTQ community, and you say that you're a moderate, reasonable Republican, so what do you say about this?
We voted on gay marriage. I voted for it.
Okay.
So my positions today are the same as they would be 6 months ago. Thank you.
And do you see how she earns audience applause for this? Again, this woman has a cunning to her, right? She is a grifter in the sense that she's ideologically inconsistent. She'll trade positions, and again, we'll explore this a bit more as the interview develops. But she's extremely good at appealing to the idea that, listen, she's a moderate, fun Republican. Look how she earned the applause of the audience at The Daily Show, right? We'll see what happens.
My position is, if you are gay and you want to be as happily or miserably married as a straight couple, more power. More power to you. If you want to serve our country and take a bullet for our nation, then you ought to be able to do that. And so my position is going to be different than the speaker's, and that's okay. But he's a guy that I do believe will be honest and tell the truth. And, Democrats and Republicans didn't trust the last guy. And at least we know where.
So we could keep going, but this was her defense. And again, I hate to give it to her, but she's pretty good in that answer. So know how she pivots again to her relatively pro LGBTQ record. And then she says, listen, Mike Johnson may be a religious bigot, but at least he's honest, unlike Kevin McCarthy. So she redirects the issue. She also deflects it with humor, right? So she says that LGBTQ people should be as happily or miserably married as any straight couple, which again earned laughs from the audience. She's very good at weaponizing humor and deflection, very skilled at what she does with respect to image politics.
Well, what does it say to gay Americans that this man is now the party's leader, though? Like, what if that still is truth, what I just read?
Well, I mean, it's not going to pass. The vast majority of members of this Congress, both Republican and Democrat, support LGBTQ, gay marriage. So that's not really going to have an influence on what we do as a House, because we voted on these things and voted to codify gay marriage.
So again, she's saying, listen, it doesn't matter that the most powerful elected Republican, whom I enthusiastically support, by the way, is a religious bigot, because there are sufficient majorities, mostly from the Democratic Party, but even a bit from the Republican Party, that will keep his religious bigotry in check. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement, and it's probably not going to encourage members of the LGBTQ community, whom Nancy Mace says she's trying to court.
Now that the chaos is over, you've got some probable votes coming up. So I'm going to ask you a couple.
Okay.
Will you vote to expel Santos, even though it might cost the GOP a seat?
I have not read the resolution to expel Santos. I have demanded his resignation from day one when I found out he lied to get into office. The right and honorable thing would be to resign. He hasn't done that yet. I'd want to read it and see what the process is if it goes through. I'm a civil rights person. I do a lot of civil rights work, but there has to be due process. So does it go through the ethics committee? That would be my first question before I make a decision on that. We may actually be voting on that this week.
Okay. So right there's another example of how she's very good at giving an answer. So even though George Santos is, federally indicted, he's credibly indicted, we know for a fact that he has defrauded his constituency. 80% of his own constituents want him to resign. And now he has his fellow New York Republicans introducing a privilege motion to get him expelled from Congress. Note how she won't commit to it. She will say, listen, I've demanded that he resign, but expelling him, that's different. How is it substantively different? You don't have to be convicted of a crime to merit expulsion from Congress. She's deliberately conflating these two things because, of course, at the end of the day, cynical Republicans and grifters like her, they understand they have a razor-thin majority in the House of Representatives. And as repulsive as Santos may personally be to her, and I wouldn't be surprised if she does find him repulsive, at the end of the day, he is an additional vote for that majority. So she won't commit to it. Just, again, very excellent pivoting and deflection to try to move the goalpost in a very subtle way. By the way, I'll point out, Santos has already been referred to the Ethics Committee, which she well knows because Democrats tried to impeach him back in May. And her party, the Republicans, blocked it and said, no, we can't expel him. Let's refer him to the Ethics Committee. So it's already been done. But here's where we start to see Nancy Mace trip. And it turns to the topic of Donald Trump and Joe Biden.
Republicans want to impeach Biden for corruption and bribery. Do you think that's valid, or is it just like a tit for tat because of the 2 times Trump has been impeached?
Well, I can tell you the former speaker went to conservatives a few months ago and said, hey, we are definitely impeaching Joe Biden. And then he went to House moderates the same day, 2 hours later, and said, we're never going to impeach Joe Biden. That should not be the answer. That's not leadership. What we should do is follow the facts, follow the truth, and then come to a decision at the right time once we've had due process, once we've shown evidence whether or not an impeachment is warranted. That's what the American people want. That's what they deserve, and that's what we should do. And I do believe the new speaker will follow due process. He's a constitutional attorney, but won't make that decision in haste. It should be made when it's warranted.
You don't think that's a waste of time with everything else that's going on?
Well, corruption is a real problem in this country. And
so before we go on, so Nancy Mace, again, talks a really good game about due process. Now, I'll remind you, this is what Nancy Mace also, the same Nancy Mace, she doesn't have a doppelganger, this is the same woman, what she has to say on a different network about impeaching Joe Biden.
But I've seen suspicious activity reports that make me believe the amount of money that the Biden's family was paid off was north of $50 million. And it's not just Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, James Biden, his brother. There are grandchildren that receive money from communist China, for example. I mean, we've seen it, but
well, I have a message for Joe Biden this morning. We're coming for you. And if you will not answer the questions for the American people, the Oversight Committee will answer them for you with regards to the investigation we're going to be conducting. And it's time.
We already know the president took bribes from Burisma. I also want to add betraying your country is treason.
What's next, Congresswoman?
well, we're going to subpoena Hunter and Joe Biden, and I hope the American people are not getting their news and information from the actress who is named AOC and
There you go. Again, it sounds like she already has her mind made up, and this isn't a matter of due process whatsoever. But to get back to the Daily Show interview, because again, she continues to stumble.
I have seen bank accounts. It is. But I have seen bank accounts of the president's grandchildren with money directly from communist China. That should not be happening in our country, and it should be exposed for every American to see and then decide whether or not that's okay. Whether there's an impeachment or not, I want people to see the evidence that I've seen and make a decision for themselves.
Do you believe?
So again, she says that corruption is a big deal, which it is, but the reason she's being laughed at is because she has a very selective view of corruption. I will also point out that it's not an impeachable offense for President Biden's grandchildren to receive money from any country unless there was a crime committed or unless President Biden violated U.S. policy to facilitate that money. Just a minor detail. But here's where Charlamagne the God really gets her, and this is where the audience really turns on her. And watch how uncomfortable she gets.
Believe the evidence against Donald Trump?
Which evidence?
All, I mean, exactly.
What are we talking about?
Pick one. Pick one of the 91 charges.
Which indictment? I mean, which one?
There's a lot of them. Let's just say Georgia.
Georgia, that would be over the election fraud. I haven't seen the evidence yet. I haven't seen it. There will be a trial.
Okay.
And everyone is allowed, again, I do a lot of civil rights work, and everyone is allowed due process under the law. And if they're found guilty, they take responsibility for that. But I haven't seen evidence to show that he's guilty of that. Now, there are a lot of people around him that did a lot of things. There's that Sidney Powell that took like a database, like a voter database maybe, and I don't know. So it's...
He didn't grab mine.
No.
Congresswoman Nancy Mace, ladies and gentlemen.
So you see how bad that got at the end? There's a reason that got bad at the end, because at the end of the day, Nancy Mace is not a principled actor. She's not. She grades the Republicans and the right wing in this country on a curve. So she is absolutely convinced, or at least says she's absolutely convinced, that Joe Biden is guilty, even though they've not been able to produce any meaningful evidence against President Biden. They constantly move the goalposts. Then you have the 91, credible counts of crime against Donald Trump, and she just deflects. Well, I haven't seen the evidence. I really don't know anything about it. Then, as to try to throw a bone, notice the rhetorical trick she does there. She tries to throw a bone and say, well, Sidney Powell, other people around Trump, they did some really bad things, to try to reestablish some sort of common ground, which she knew she'd basically collapsed. She lost any credibility with Charlamagne the God and the audience as soon as they started to laugh at her. Oh, yeah, well, I don't know anything about this. I believe in due process. But hey, just to show you how cool and moderate and reasonable I am, let me tell you about some other people who've done some bad things that are in Trump's orbit. Does that count? Well, no, it doesn't count. It really doesn't. So, again, I've made multiple videos about Nancy Mace and Republicans like her. I think that she's very dangerous in her own way. She's certainly not, one of the most powerful Republicans. She's certainly not as openly deranged as somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Matt Gaetz. But she's in some ways potentially more dangerous because, again, she's really, really good at hiding her grift. And I'm sure we'll see her on other interviews past this, but I just wanted to point this out because the trajectory was incredible. She started off really strong. Even I've got to give her credit on how well she answered some of these questions. And then by the end, she pushed it too far. She betrayed her lack of principles too openly. And the audience, which previously applauded her, and the host, which was previously indulgent of her, all started to laugh at and heckle her, as they should.